All righty. We're gonna go ahead and get started here. I'm sorry, I'm talking very quietly. You all are muted right now. Towards the end, there will be questions where you can be unmuted, but for now, you will not be able to unmute yourself. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat too. Thank you for tuning in for tonight's free print history webinar with Brittany Hudak. My name is Elise Herrera. I'm Zygote Shop Tech. We ask that you please remain muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, please hold them till the end and talk when there will be a Q&A. If you have any technical questions, you can drop them in the chat, which will be monitored. Thanks to the support of our generous members, we are able to present this program free. If you aren't already a member of Zygote, we would love your support. For only $50, you can purchase a year-long Zygote community membership and help us to continue to provide free programming like this. I'll drop a link in the chat, our brand new website where you can join easily and see all the benefit membership provides, including our new Arts Pass program. Through the Arts Pass program, your Zygote membership is now recognized with your partner organizations, Spaces Gallery, and Praxis Fiber Workshop. Click the link I'm dropping, which I'm going to do that in one moment. And I'm going to turn it over to Brittany while I do that, an art historian. This is Brittany M. Hudak, an art historian and Zygote Senior Program Manager.
Hi, everyone. We'll just wait just a few more minutes, I think, while a couple of people join us. As you can see, Elise just dropped the link in the chat. That's for Zygote's membership. Thanks to supporters, membership supporters, and other donators and nice people, we can have free programming like this series of print history webinars that I guess this is the third one that we've done in about a year. My name's Brittany M. Hudak. I'm an art historian, but I'm also the senior program manager at Zygote Press. My background is in 19th century and early 20th century art history, specifically looking at photography, the history of photography, and printmaking. So today we are going to talk about a specific subject. Okay, we'll wait one more minute. If you have any questions, if you could please hold them until the end of the program. We will have a Q&A when Elise will, then you can unmute yourself or raise your hand, and Elise will facilitate any questions you may have. This is also being recorded, so if you have to run off or do something more fun, that's totally understandable. We'll have this on YouTube. The recording will be on YouTube for you to watch. We'll send out the link next week. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you have any technical problems during the program, you can drop a message in the chat and Elise will help you with anything. Okay, also, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for, hold on one second. I just want to hide this. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this rescheduled print history webinar. I unfortunately got COVID and was down for the count when I was supposed to have it the last time. So thanks for joining us tonight. The subject tonight is Thea Proctor and queer networks of printmaking. It's my pleasure to share with you. I will say right out of the gate that this is some very early research that I have been conducting on the Australian artist Thea Proctor. One of my areas of interest is how printmaking was used as a conduit for exchange between queer women artists, specifically in the early 20th century. If you would like to hear more of my research, you can, hold on, let me just move my little face. You can watch my last lecture on Blanche Lazelle and the colony of queer printmakers that were working in Provincetown, Massachusetts. That's available on Zygote's YouTube page. If you go to YouTube and simply type in Zygote Press, I think Zygote Press with no space between it, that will give you the last print history webinar, which does cover some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. But tonight we're going to focus in on one or two artists that are Australian, and mostly the single artist, Thea Proctor. although some of the artists that I will be mentioning tonight will be from the previous lecture as well. So you don't have to, it's not like a sequel. You don't have to watch the first one to understand the second one, but that's because there's overlapping themes here. I am focusing on how women artists that did not fit in traditional gender roles gravitated towards printmaking in this time period and each other. I wanted to explain, first of all, that I use the term queer to describe these women artists almost exclusively. That's a personal choice. I think that queer embraces the manyfold sexual preferences of these women, but most importantly, what it does acknowledge is these women's non-heterosexualities. My interest is exploring the connection between female sexual dissidence and the practices of art making in this time period, and how those two intertwine. And as a case study, Thea Proctor is the perfect vehicle to explore my thesis that there is direct conduits of exchange between women that exist outside of traditional gender norms and certain practices of printmaking in the early 20th century. So Thea Proctor, who you can see here, this is actually a drawing by George Lambert, 1905 on the left. And then you can see on the right, this is one of her prints. This is a 1932 print that we'll be discussing later. She was born in Armidale, New South Wales in 1879. Her father was a solicitor, a lawyer, but he was also a politician. So she did come from a well-to-do family. But her parents separated in 1892, which, was not a normal occurrence, not an everyday kind of thing to happen. And she decided to stay with her mother. So she and her mother moved closer to Sydney to stay with her grandmother, who was a huge influence on her and actually encouraged young Thea to take up painting. She began her first art studies at the Sydney Art School, but like many young artists in Sydney of means, like she was able to leave for London in 1903 to pursue her art studies. She was to stay in London, excepting a brief interval between 1912 and 1914 until after World War I. And when she returned to Sydney forever in 1921, the ideas and the techniques that she had learned there in London propelled her to the front line of contemporary art and design in Australia. She was once described by a close friend as a breathtaking beauty and was known for her statuesque good looks. But from about 1902 until she died, according to historians, she was a quote unquote single woman. It's exactly this kind of coded language, single, spinster, words like that is traditionally used by historians to describe any woman that didn't fit neatly into normal heterosexual categories. One friend wrote that Proctor was, quote, incapable of feeling any kind of passion or sexual feeling for anybody, which is quite a dramatic quote, but just, I think, shows that while I have no idea personally what her proclivities were, they were in question by her friends at the time. She was, historians have said she was, quote, associated with the artist George Lambert, also another male artist, Sidney Long, but also Eunice Graham and Margaret Preston. For much of her life, Thea Proctor lived between Australia and the UK and was leading a very active social life wherever she was based, and often situating herself within queer artistic circles. Her relationships, or close relationships, were of great and fleeting intensity, with often having very abrupt disagreements and dramatic breakdowns and breakups. So again, personally, I have no idea. Nowhere in the historical record does it say exactly what her sexual identity leaned towards, but her work was included in the 1996 exhibition Queer Stories from the National Gallery of Victoria, despite the fact that nowhere in the many art historical articles, exhibition catalogs, and books that cover her life and art, it never explicitly addresses her sexuality in any way. She is often lumped with the artist George Lambert, who was a pretty famous painter that she certainly had a relationship with, and she posed for him many times. And friends did speculate. He was married, he had a family. What transpired between them, we will never know. But what we do know now is very often Thea Proctor is lumped in with this male painter, George Lambert, as when she appears in the art historical discourse, it's as one of his students, which is curious to me because while she certainly did learn from George Lambert, she never really studied with him explicitly, and the two never shared artistic goals. But women artists are so often defined by and categorized by historians by their relationships with men, which comes as no surprise at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, when women still made up a very small percentage of artists in any academic setting and an even much smaller percentage in a print shop. So tonight, I will be looking at Proctor outside of her relationship to George Lambert and the other more famous male artists in her circles. I will plot her trajectory as a young modern woman that did not fit easily in societal norms, and how printmaking was to play a role in that journey. At age 16 in the mid 1890s, like I said, she was living with her grandmother after her parents had separated. She began her art studies at Julian Ashton School in King Street, Sydney. She studied mainly drawing, but also compositional design, which would greatly impact the way her later prints appeared, the compositional techniques that she used, and the illustrative quality of her work. Here you can see a very lovely, very Art Nouveau unfinished drawing from this early period when she was going to school in Sydney. But in 1903, like many of the young artists of means working in Sydney, Proctor set sail to London with her mother to continue her art studies. I cannot stress enough the privilege necessary to undertake such a voyage. But I will say that they really were not on the, they were solidly middle class. They were not wealthy people. So it was quite an undertaking for them to make this passage. But as white women of means, they were able to take this passage. And while it wasn't unusual for a woman to study art at this time, I mean, you can see in this picture right here, their numbers were far less than their male counterparts in these early years. Soon after her arrival in London, Proctor began to take classes at St. John's Wood Art School. And you can see here a picture of a class. I'm not sure if she's actually in this particular picture, but you can see that there are women and they're studying from the figure, albeit a clothed figure. And there's, 10 women in the room. Were I to show you a picture of the male figure drawing class, it would be packed to the gills and the figure would definitely be nude. So women were still, not as comfortable in these academic art circles. And the only reason she went to this school was because she wanted to take a few classes to gear up for the exams to enter the Royal Academy of Art in London, the most prestigious school of art in London, where you have to take a series of very rigorous, I think it's like a 5-day long exam to gain entry. But her exams had to be put on hold because she had to take 2 months off because of eye strain, which is something that comes up throughout her life. Now we have technology and, she probably needed glasses. There were glasses available, but, the healthcare at the time was not as great. And she did suffer quite a bit of eye strain over the years. And so she took 2 months off and she never did get to go or even test to go to the Royal Academy. But despite this setback, Proctor was starting to mix with a circle of decidedly modern artists, primarily male artists who were very famous in London at the time, including William Orpin, Augustus John, Philip Wilson Steer, and then there was a group of expatriate Australian artists, modern artists like Charles Condor, Arthur Street, and Tom Roberts. And her mother was still there, but she only stayed long enough to get her established, got her into a, semi-decent boarding situation, and then returned to Australia, leaving Thea on her own. Despite not getting to test for the Royal Academy, Proctor was actually meeting with some success in London. She exhibited her works at juried shows at the Royal Academy, the New English Art Club, the Goupil galleries and Grafton galleries. Around this time, she won a 30-pound prize, which she then she completely just blew on a pair of earrings, which just shows, this is a young woman. So she's working primarily in watercolor at this point, and a lot of that has to do with access and with her cash flow situation. Watercolors are less expensive than oil at this time period, and she can work on paper. She spent most of her time portraying scenes from the theater, such as this design. This is actually a design for a fan from 1909, which I love for the fact that she included the musicians in the foreground, very like Toulouse-Lautrec or some of the other Art Nouveau artists, poster artists that she so admired. And you can see that she's using very strong principles of design and composition in this rather tightly painted scene. Here is a much looser watercolor. This is a sketch of ballet dancers, a much more informal scene, perhaps even at a rehearsal. Her work during this early London period was praised by critics, but at the same time, she suffered from more eye strain again and started running out of money pretty quickly. She recalls in a letter sitting first on one leg and then the other leg to keep them warm. So like one leg she would keep under her to keep warm and then switch them out. And that way she could save her few pennies to light the gas fire only in the evenings. And she went around to knock on doors seeking modeling work because, like I said, she was quite, you saw the photos, she was a very good looking young lady. And so she was able to find some work as an artist model. And she took on a few commissions around this time, but she was never paid enough to be able to feel a sense of security living in London during this early period, and was suffering from more eye strain. So she returned to Australia in 1912 to only become even more frustrated. She's staying with her grandmother again near Sydney, and she now had enough work to exhibit at the Society of Artists November show in Sydney. And she also mounted her very first solo exhibition of 71 pieces at the Melbourne Fine Arts Society in 1913. That's quite a lot, 71 watercolors, and most of them were designs for fans like this one that you see here. She then, much of that work sold out of that show, and one of her fan designs, the one that you see here, this was in that show, was acquired by the National Gallery of Victoria in 1913. So she's meeting with critical and professional success. She then held a second solo show, this time in Sydney at Horden's Fine Art Gallery. But by this time, she was really fed up with life in Australia. And looking back on her kind of lean years in London, she recalled, quote, "I have no regrets about having stayed in London with no money. There are things one simply has to do in life. I had to get away from Sydney suburbia. But after coming back here, now knowing what London means, I simply must go back." So even though she was doing well and making money, she couldn't stand being back in Australia, so she went back to London. Her second stint in London saw a notable change in her art making because she began to take lessons in lithography on Tuesday evenings at the Chelsea Polytechnic between the years 1915 and 1921. On every Tuesday, and it must have been the one that they allowed women to go to, she was able to learn the basics of lithography. This school today is still open. It's actually known as the very famous Chelsea School of Art. But back then, the curriculum during this early period was largely vocational and aimed more towards the commercial aspects of art, illustration, textiles. They had etching and lithography, and also taught architecture. So she's learning lithography. Her earliest efforts were likely based on subjects perhaps sketched in Australia. The Tame Bird of 1916 shows a group by the seaside with kind of exotic plants that likely, this is not a scene that she would have seen in her dumpy apartment in London. It features women and children enjoying themselves in a very free-spirited but kind of highly composed composition. And you can see, as far as the lithograph, it's pretty basic, it really captures the artist's hand. It looks like a drawing. And you wouldn't know it was a lithograph unless it's a lithograph. Likewise, here's another early lithograph called The Shell. Proctor's probably basing this on a sketch from Australia. And on this one, you can definitely see there is this same kind of weeping willow tree, but that tree on the left with the cone-shaped flowers and the sea in the background, does not look like a London scene. This again features women and children enjoying themselves, gathering shells, not common sights in London, but hearkening maybe back to a more outdoor way of living that she experienced in Australia. But by 1918, she's starting to use glimpses of her life in London for her prints, primarily quiet moments of women in private, interiors such as this one, the toilet, which doesn't mean an actual toilet, it means women getting ready to go out. So you can see a woman here is pulling up her stockings, the other one is looking at the back of her head with a mirror in another mirror, and they're getting ready for a night out. This is actually in the apartment that Thea Proctor lived at the time, I know, because of the grill work outside the window. Much like her earlier watercolors, these works show, again, a strong sense of draftsmanship, but they usually feature intimate scenes of women. The Reverie from 1919 also features a rather dramatically posed woman in a quiet London interior, but Proctor is by now starting to show a real deftness for the medium. I wish there was more information about what the print shop in Chelsea was like, but there just isn't a lot of information about it. I know she only had access on Tuesdays, but it's possible, in fact, it's very possible that she was only drawing the stones and men were making the actual prints. It's not clear. This is just a guess on my part, but it's a subject that I will return to later. Works like this one, Stunting, show a very modern, a decidedly modern kind of attitude. First of all, it features an airplane, which is a relatively new invention at the time. It's doing tricks in the sky, demarked by these broad swaths of light. These, this is during World War I, too. So we have to remember that this is wartime London, where she and her friend are living in this apartment. And the composition itself reflects the Art Deco streamlined machine age kind of design beginning to become popular at the time. Works like this start to get her noticed, and she started to develop a reputation in London as a lithographer. Proctor had enough work to gain entry into the Sennefelder Club, which was exclusively a printmaking club. She was one of the few women in that club, and was also exhibiting her lithographs with the International Society of Sculptors, Painters, and Gravers, which means printmakers. And she was also showing her lithographs at the Goupil Gallery, which was a kind of avant-garde space in London at this time. The model for most of the women in the previous prints that I just showed, and the friend that I spoke of that she was living with in London, was Eunice Graham. Eunice was married to Gilbert Graham, but the two were separated. Her husband was actually serving in Germany in the war. And during the war, Eunice was alone in London when she met Thea Proctor. Between 1914 and 1921, the two women lived together at various addresses in London, but mostly in Chelsea. And the Chelsea neighborhood was known for its bohemian and avant-garde inhabitants. It was an area where lesbians and gay men could live openly. Also artists, obviously, a lot of artists lived in this neighborhood. While never explicitly stated, Proctor recalled the two being, quote, together during most of my bad years. Eunice modeled frequently for Proctor's prints. The two were clearly sharing a very special kind of life together in London during the war. You can see here, this is Eunice in the one by the seaside. You can tell by her hair, and this is Eunice here in this right here. But when the war ended, Eunice made her way to Holland to be reunited with her husband, leaving Proctor alone. And at some point, right around this time, Proctor learned how to make color lithographs, making prints like this one, The Hat Shop, which actually I think resembles a color woodblock print with this kind of broad flat planes of unmodulated color and a very modern block-like composition. Also, the fact that these are, first of all, that's definitely Eunice, because she has that little bun in the back of her head in the foreground. But these are very modern women trying on very strange avant-garde hats. So it has a very modern sensibility to it. But right around this time, the eye strain returned. And it's funny, her eye strain always pops up at times of great stress. So I don't know if the eye strain may have been an excuse for depression or if it was involved with her depression. And other coded words for this time period to say, she suffered a bout of ill health around this time period, right when Eunice left to go back to her husband. So even though Thea had been very happy in London she lived there for 18 years, she decided to return to Sydney in 1921. Proctor was known for her interest in fashion, like you can see here. She designed her own clothing and was always trying to express her individuality and also to signal to others that she is an avant-garde modern artist. On her return from London in the early 1920s, Proctor was extremely unimpressed with the state of fashion and the country bumpkins in Australia. There was a kind of poor availability of the sort of luxury fabric that she had been accustomed to using in London, and particularly was just upset by the way Australian women wore what she considered very shapeless and sad hats, which I think is really funny. In the early to mid 20s, she started to design covers for the Home magazine, many of which featured this new kind of modern woman that she aspired to be and that she definitely resembled. And these, we think of these women kind of the flapper style, the bobbed hair, 1920s clothing. You can see she also loves animals. There's cats and dogs in a lot of her imagery, which I love just personally. Here's a great one. I like this one a lot because it actually juxtaposes a woman from the 19th century. On the right-hand side, you can see like the hansom cab and the old ways. And then on the left is the new woman. She's smoking a cigarette. She's got the cloche hat on. And there's a woman, the same, presumably similar woman is driving the car on the left-hand side. So this is showing that Thea Proctor is aligning herself very seriously with the modern attitude towards women. They often called it the new woman, new modern women. So she's back in Australia and she set up a studio in the Grosvenor building and she started teaching classes. She regarded herself as one of the first modern artists to exhibit in Australia. She was quite well known in the society pages. She was regularly attending art openings. She was always impeccably dressed in lavender or violet. Her entire outfit would be purple, which some believe was a coded way to signal her lesbianism to others. And it came up in my research for Provincetown as well. Women that wore purple were also aligned with the suffragette movement at the time. And I think it just denoted a woman that was non-traditional, a woman who was not going to suffer men lightly. I don't know enough that, like I said, I'm still kind of sorting some of these out, but she also attended fancy dress parties. She was very interested in historic fashion and kind of dressing up in historic fashion. So you can see this outrageous costume here. I mean, she's still known as a printmaker at this time, but she's only known so far as a lithographer. But before leaving London, Proctor had the idea of bringing with her to Australia a wholesale exhibition of lithographs organized by that club I mentioned, the Sennefelder Club. So they, as a group, had also taken a whole group of their lithographs and shown them in Rome and in Venice. So she thought, well, if I'm going back, we should show them in Australia as well. And finally, she was able to get the Fine Arts Society Gallery in Melbourne to agree to show the work in December of 1921. At the preview opening night, Proctor demonstrated drawing on a lithostone right there in the gallery, and she made this self-portrait. After finishing the drawing on the stone, it was then handed over to Daryl Lindsay and Cyril Dillon, who had supplied the press. So then her work is done. you know, she can't pick up the stone probably either. These two men come over and they take the stone and they do the manly work of creating the print. So as I mentioned earlier, while lithography was an acceptable medium for women artists to undertake, the actual printing was almost exclusively done by men. And the presses were still somehow off limits to women. And this is not, you know, 100% the case. There are definitely examples of women working with presses, but women were generally regarded as too weak to operate them, too weak to deal with the heavy stones. And having to use a press was, you know, it limited you as a woman artist, especially in Australia, where there certainly weren't as many presses as she had access to back in London. You know, she had much greater access to presses. So around this time, she gave up lithography altogether and took up a completely new form of printmaking, woodblock printing, mostly due to the influence of this woman, Margaret Preston. Margaret Preston was also a Sydney artist who went to Europe to study art, much like Thea Proctor. At some point, Proctor had seen one of Margaret Preston's paintings at the New English Art Club and remembers being impressed with her work. And while the two were kind of there overlapping a couple of different times, they weren't close in London. They were never close while they were abroad, but met when they both returned after the war. Preston was born in Adelaide in 1875 and studied in Melbourne and Sydney. Then she went to Munich and Paris. The two might have met in London around 1912 when Preston was exhibiting paintings at the New Salon in Paris and the Royal Academy. So their paths might have crossed at that time. It was in Paris around 1913 that Preston first began to learn how to make color woodblock prints. She was influenced by the Japanese prints on view in the French capital while she was there. At this time period in the early 20th century, late 19th century, Japanese ukiyo woodblock prints were all the rage in Paris, and there were plenty of opportunities for Margaret Preston to see them. And you can clearly see, here's a 1916 Still Life and Flowers, that she is being influenced by Japanese prints, like in this small multicolor woodblock print, which in the notes, I didn't write this down, it says produced in the Japanese style with so many X many blocks, because this was done in the traditional multi-block style of carving a different block for each color in the image. And it's a small little, and you can even tell by the way she signed her name in this kind of vertical, it just has a very Japanese feel to it. While in Paris, links to Japanese printmaking techniques may also have come through her personal association. English-speaking students in Paris tended to maintain close and supportive relationships. It was around this time that she met Ethel Mars, the noted Provincetown woodcut artist that I featured in my last lecture. Here is Ethel and her partner, Maud Squire. These two women lived in Paris openly as lesbians in the early 20th century, so much so that they inspired two characters in one of Gertrude Stein's stories, the words for which leave very little to the imagination. So Miss Fur and Miss Skeen, they were definitely very, 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 very gay. Mars was an exceptional printmaker. And when Mars and Margaret Preston met, they likely exchanged ideas, maybe even taught each other. Here's an example of Ethel Mars's work from the same time period. This is a multi-block woodcut. And this is an example of one of these conduits of exchange between queer or non-traditional women artists who were maybe not always welcome in the male-dominated print shops, but could easily teach each other in an apartment how to make woodblock prints. And a press is not necessary to make them. So again, this is one of the conduits through which these women are networking information. Then Margaret Preston takes this knowledge back to Sydney in 1920, and Preston starts to abandon the multi-block technique right away. And I completely understand why. It's very arduous and time consuming, and it's difficult to register. So instead, she's starting to leave her prints either in black and white or hand coloring them with watercolor, like this lovely print of Shell Cove from 1920. So she's showing an Australian view in this new kind of Japanese technique. But when she returned to Australia, Thea Proctor and Margaret Preston began a very close friendship that included supporting each other's efforts in printmaking. Preston taught Proctor how to make woodblock prints and taught her kind of the intricacies of the Japanese woodblock printmaking. But instead of making multi-block woodcut prints or even white line prints, which I talked about with the Provincetown printmakers, these two artists instead chose to print a key block just in black and white, and then would hand color with gouache or watercolor individually each print. And this became a very intense collaboration in between 1920 and 1925 between these two women. And so much so that this intensive collaboration led them to hold a joint exhibition together at the Grosvenor Gallery in Sydney at the end of 1925. And here are two of the works from that year. On the left, you can see Margaret Preston using the woodblock technique primarily to show vegetal still life type things. And on the right, Thea Proctor still using the figure, the poupée, which means the doll. You can see the little girls holding this doll, and very modern surface decoration, zigzag lines, very flat, very modular, very much flat, modern type composition. And while Preston tended to focus on the wildlife, like here's two black cockatoos from 1925, and the flowers native to Australia, she became very interested in native species, native flora and fauna. But Proctor instead favored these kind of fantastical figural scenes that were weirdly like out of time, out of place. They weren't based on any sort of, reality. This is the swing. It's reminiscent of her earlier compositions made in London. And again, you can see her attention to these historical costumes that she was so fond of, but you can tell by these dazzling colors and just the flatness of the composition, especially that gradient in the background, that she's looking towards Japanese prints for inspiration for her work. Now, Proctor continued to, in her words, toy with the medium into the 1930s. And amongst these works in this time period are some of the images for which she is best known today. But she did not personally regard her woodcuts as particularly significant to her oeuvre at the time. Images like this, Summer. It shows a very strong interest in modern design. This composition is very block light, has broad planes of color, the decorative surfaces that I keep talking about. Again, she shows us a quiet, intimate scene of a woman and a young woman enjoying the outdoor lifestyle that was possible in a place like Sydney. She's on a hammock. There's a dog, they're looking at books, and in the background, this high horizon line, you can see the ocean and then some sort of an exotic yucca plant or tree. Proctor wrote about this piece specifically. The print Summer was one of 5 or 6 woodcuts I did and then hand colored. I was not interested enough to do separate prints for each color. I think she means separate blocks for each color. It was made on some soft wood that Margaret Preston gave me, but I don't remember it very fondly. So while these were kind of experiments for her, I think, she never really took to the medium as anything more than just something she was doing incidentally at the time. And again, heavily influenced by Margaret Preston and Margaret Preston's work. But for an artist only mildly interested in the medium, around this time, Proctor produced some stunning examples of hand-colored woodblock prints. Perhaps her most famous is The Rose of 1927. While it was produced as a standalone print, it was the design for it was used, here you can see, as the cover for The Home, the Home magazine, which was that kind of avant-garde design magazine. This is the same year, and you can see though that it's inverted, which is funny because this is probably the actual drawing that she used on the block. So a friend observed Thea Proctor making this work and described her working method for making this print in particular. He said she traced a pencil drawing, a finished enough drawing that ended up good enough to go on the cover of the home after some retouching. So that means that this drawing on the cover of the home is the finished drawing that she transferred to the block onto a wood block of the same size and transferred all its details onto the wood, making no concessions to the new medium. In contrast to her friend Margaret, Proctor never let the woody origin of the work show through. The character of the woodcut was not important to her. An accident had no place. And I think that's really interesting to think about. Like, while this is a woodcut, right? She's making a woodcut, but she is not exploiting the texture of the woodcut. She's using it, and yet she's not using it really for reproductive purposes either. She made very small additions. So for example, and mostly because if you're hand painting them, then they become very labor intensive. So especially the hand painted ones, there's usually only 5. So she, this is, I think, number 4 of 5. And so they're small additions. She's hand painting them, but they look like woodcuts, but she's not exploiting the wood grain in the way that other artists did at the time. And that might be why she's like kind of doesn't look at this as maybe the best medium, best vehicle for her work. For someone, who didn't care for the medium, she really excelled at some really amazing designs in this tiny 5-year time period between 1925, when she showed at the Grosvenor Gallery with Margaret Preston, and in the early 1930s, when she gave it up altogether. And her experiments start to get even flatter and more modern, and her aesthetic continues to push in this new direction where space is kind of contracted. Here you can see in this composition, especially, it's not even very clear where the horizon line is. This is almost entirely decorative surface and pattern, and there's so much movement in it. It's just a really, really well done design. She also, again, is very interested in the theater, and that never went away for her entire life. She was always associating herself with the ballet russe, with avant-garde bohemian dancers, and also circus performers. This is the Peep Show. So this is obviously at a circus. You can see the little kids looking into the machine where you spin the thing and then a naked lady takes her clothes off. Or you can see the Poirot in the background. There's jugglers and dancers, and then a mother standing there. But again, this is 19th century costume. Everyone is wearing 90s. This is 1928. That's not, so it's like it's out of time and out of space. Her work exists in this weird fantasy realm where she could exploit her interest in fashion history, which at this time she was starting to collect books on fashion history to make her drawings more accurate. She also began teaching lino cutting around this time to students at the Sydney Art School. I couldn't find any examples of, I don't know if any of her lino cuts actually exist or survived. But as you can see by all these woodcuts that I just showed you from around this period, they would be easily adapted to that medium. I'm pretty sure she's teaching lino cutting because linoleum is less expensive than getting, the nice wood to be able to make a woodcut. You need pretty nice wood, and I think and the tools cost more money. So at around this time, linoleum also existed. So, like linoleum was a new invention. Linoleum was not around in the 1890s, or maybe it was, but it certainly wasn't used as an artistic medium. So she's teaching young people lino cutting, and but she's continuing on with the woodblock printing to some extent, but is starting to slow down by the end of the 1920s. And you can see she still favors fantasy fashions from the 18th century, but these are combined with a very modern sensibility. And in this case, also a cat, of course, gotta have cat. Proctor didn't always color her woodblock prints either towards 1930. And I think that, again, that says a lot about her output and the amount of time that it takes to paint these. So you can see here, this is a very famous image of her. It's called Women with Fans. It was completed in 1930. Here you can see it printed in black and white, but it is based on an earlier watercolor design that she did called The Bay, and that was completed in 1927, which was also used in the Home magazine. I couldn't find an image, but this was on the cover in 1927 of the Home magazine. And I think that it was so popular that in this case, she decided to make a woodcut of it so that she could make copies to sell. So she actually did make a wood block. Even it's really interesting to compare the two images and kind of see the compositional shifts or changes, decisions that she made between the two mediums. And the thing that I like the most is that this woman in the background, who's already a rather masculine looking woman in this velvet kind of robe, becomes even more masculine looking, I think, in this woodcut. And again, these are fantastical costumes. The women's hair is not 19th century, it's 1920s, it's 1930s, and yet they're wearing these costumes that appear somewhat historic, almost like they're playing fantasy role-playing dress up. And, you know, there were a lot of fancy dress balls at the time where people did go, especially artists, masks and balls that they would go to kind of dressed as these historic characters. So that's being reflected in this too. But her experiments, like I said, in woodcuts pretty much end by 1932. And this is the piece that I started with at the beginning on the right, which I think is kind of the culmination of her exploration of historic fashion. The title of this print is 1875. So she's even giving it an actual date. And the costume in it is likely based on that historic fashion research that she's doing at the time. You have two women, they have their fans, and of course there's a cat. It should also, and then on the left, you know, Margaret Preston is still also making woodcuts, but again, she is focusing much more on native Australian flora and fauna, and then starts to dabble into Aboriginal art, which I'm not even going to get into that whole thing that she went into. But Margaret or Thea Proctor never had any interest. She hated Australia. You know, she wanted to be in a different time, in a different era, much more sophisticated way of life. You know, she considered herself far more cosmopolitan than everyone else, and so was not interested in magnolias, for example, like this lovely woodcut, hand-colored. And around this time, I should also point out that Thea and Margaret had a terrible falling out at this time period. And apparently they fell out over the acquisition of one of Proctor's prints from their joint show by the Art Gallery of New South Wales. So that joint show that they had in 1925, where they exclusively showed their hand-colored wood block prints, a couple years later, the Art Gallery of New South Wales chose one work to purchase for their collection, and it was by Thea Proctor, not Margaret Preston. So Preston went over to Proctor's for afternoon tea and supposedly brought a plate of cookies. And when Thea gave her the news that the trustees had selected one of her works over one of Margaret's works, she supposedly threw the cookies at Proctor and stormed out and never spoke to her again. And while this is probably apocryphal and completely unprovable, I can't imagine that because Margaret was the one that brought this form of printmaking to Australia. She's the one who taught Thea Proctor how to do it. To see her have so much more success in the medium must have been a hard pill for her to swallow. And the two were never to be close again, even though they both remained in Sydney. They both taught art well into the 1940s, 50s, even in the 1960s, but never would be at the same opening and never speak to each other, standing at the other side of the room from each other. And what really transpired between the women, you know, Preston was married, but she lived separately from her husband. She had her own apartment. At one point, she and Thea definitely lived together in that same apartment. Again, I'm not going to conjecture on what their sexual relationship was, but what I can say is that, you know, Thea was a very, very strong-willed person and often had very spectacular breakups with both men and women and friends and everyone, and never married, never had children. And, she had these fiery breakups throughout her life. So Thea Proctor was fed up with making lithographs, and we'll never really know what the cause of their falling out was, other than, what would have happened had the two of them actually joined forces. Because what happens next, and this is the part that I still need to do quite a bit of research in, is the next generation of women artists that take up the medium, that are taking lino cut lessons from from Thea Proctor. And then also Margaret Preston is teaching woodblock printing to women in Sydney. So there's the next generation of women artists coming out of art school in the 1930s are learning the technique from these two women, albeit in two different institutions. And it's primarily women that are working with this medium. You don't find a lot of men working in woodblock printing at this time period in Sydney. So that will be definitely the next part of my research. But the two argued over, it's funny because they argued over the Art Gallery of New South Wales buying one of Thea Proctor's works. But if you go on their website today and look up the name Thea Proctor, there are 58 prints in their collection by Thea Proctor. And if you look up Margaret Preston, there are 151 prints and works of art in their collection. So it looks like Margaret Preston got the last laugh. So it's 6:51. I'm gonna end here. This is to be continued. I obviously have a lot more research to do on this, but I wanted to open it up to questions at this point. Let's see. Okay, just looking back in the chat, someone asked about the size range. These are all very small. The lithographs are small, the woodblock prints are small. I would say that none of the images that I showed you in this presentation were larger than 8.5 by 11. So they're not working large. They're definitely, but that was pretty normal for the time period. People aren't working that big in printmaking at this point. If anyone else has a question, you can raise your hand or unmute yourself. Be happy, or we don't have to have any questions or answers.
I have a question.
Hi, Gabby, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is super brilliant and
Thank you.
fascinating. I love it. Maybe you already mentioned this at the beginning, but I got cut out at the beginning for a second, but what were the primary sources you were looking at, and did you notice self-editing if you were looking at like diary entries or letters? Did you notice like moments of women withholding certain information because they knew someone might read it later?
Absolutely. And I was totally going to show you this book, The World of Thea Proctor, which was a great exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery of Australia in, I want to say 2006, 2005. And in this, you can go, in this book, they use coded language for all of the things that I just told you. But again, they're pulling from her very limited papers. So the primary sources that are available for her are in Australia, and they're not very, I think the family edited them. So there's definitely editing going. Here it is. Here's the endnotes. There are interviews, there are some letters. So, anyway, it's in the endnotes somewhere where they do discuss that there are no diaries, there are letters available. So there's no diaries. That doesn't mean that there aren't diaries either. That means that the family has not put them in any public collections. She passed away in 1966. So that's still pretty recent. And it usually takes, several generations before they start to pass on private collections of diaries. I mean, I personally, if I were to, you know, say, take this up as a doctoral topic, then that would be something I would definitely want to look into, you know, to trace her relatives and see if you can find more primary documents for her, because there's much more for Margaret Preston, because Margaret Preston was married. Margaret Preston was like I said, she embraced her nationalism as an Australian, and so was very lauded by critics. And I won't even, like I said, get into the whole her making imagery of Aboriginal art. It's really distressing. And then there's another book, a really great book called Modernism and Feminism, Australian Women Artists, 1900 to 1940. And this book is the one where it really starts to like point to some questions, you know, like there's a tie, you can tie modernism and feminism, these terms together, and you're gonna overlap with some queerness here. Again, these are very like loaded art historical terms that are throwing women into categories to kind of justify their non-traditional attitudes without explicitly saying. Now there is an exhibition catalog for queer, the one in this was in the 90s at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And that is in the 90s, there was a much more like oddly explicit way of addressing LGBT, I think they called it LGBT studies back then. But certainly I want to explore more, but it would require going to Australia and going to the National Archive of Australia in Canberra. And that's where those letters are. So I would be curious to know about not only the self-editing, the family editing, because that's usually what happens, right? And even in the press at the time, you know, I think that I had access to several articles, contemporary articles, and how critics at the time were speaking about her relationships with women. And I think that with a little bit more digging, you could probably find some more. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Gabby. Like I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg about this woman artist, and also even Margaret Preston. You know, you can Google search this and you're going to eventually come up with pretty thin results. And that's because these women are only now getting their fair due. And even though they are getting their fair dues with exhibitions like this giant one at the Gallery of New South Wales, again, there's really they're associating her with these male artists, you know, like they're positioning her against George Lambert and how his painting influenced her art making. And granted, yeah, that's true. You know, she did know him. They definitely had a relationship, but that is not what. Let's stop looking at women artists through the lens of their male, more famous counterparts, please. I mean, it's 2022, for God's sake. This is another great resource. This is a 2-volume book. It's called Printed Images by Australian Artists, 1885 to 1955. This is a 2-volume kind of huge overview of Australian printmaking. Oh, and someone asked, yes, I will put my bibliography in the email that I'm sending with the recording of this lecture. I did that last time for Provincetown, and I think that would be really helpful. So if anyone wants to see all these books and the resources that I used, like I said, this was just an intro overview, but you could do plenty more digging. And with access, you know, if you have access to OhioLink or you know, WorldCat and some of these other resources, because there are a lot of, like, for example, the exhibition catalog for her 1925 show at the Grosvenor Gallery in Sydney is not available in the United States, you know, so you know, it would require the kind of research that a doctoral student would do. You'd have to reach out to librarians in Australia to get copies of those so that I can actually see what was shown, because there's never images from those. They're always just lists, right? But at least then I would have the titles, and then maybe you can compare them back to some of the images. And they have been heavily collected. That's the last thing I want to say. Like, even like I said, in 1925 or 1930, the argument they had was about the Art Gallery of New South Wales buying one of her pieces, and they have continued. the National Gallery of Art in Canberra, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the National Gallery in Victoria, all of the major institutions in Australia have, you know, nearly 100 or at least of each of these women's prints in their collection. So that makes me really happy to see that at least Australian collections have saved their work, right? Because, you know, these kind of works on paper are ephemeral. And but even when they were contemporary, they were being lauded and collected. So hopefully more people will get to know them. And there's a couple in, I was going to check, the Cleveland Museum of Art, I think might have a Margaret Preston. I'm not 100% sure. You know what? When I send the email out, I'll look that up too. If they do have one, it's not on view, but it would just be interesting to know which print collections in the United States actually have, if their work made it all the way over here. So 7 o'clock on the dot, 1 hour. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining me this evening. It was my pleasure to share these images with you and talk a little bit about queer printmaking in the early 20th century. I'll be sending out the link next week with the recording, the bibliography, and some other resources for everyone. And I will be doing yet another one of these probably in December, November or December. So stay tuned for the next episode. We'll see what I can come up with in my research. And also thank you all for supporting Zygote Press. Thank you so much. It's contributions from supporters of Zygote that we're able to provide free programs like this. So have a great night. Thanks, everyone. I don't know why we wave. We always do this. Bye. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.